Thank you, Mr. President. The early part of 1945 was momentous in the history of the world. The defeat of Germany was obvious. Commonwealth and American troops were racing across West Germany. Stalin and the Soviet Union was racing across Poland into East Germany. And the outcome was obvious. For that reason, in February, the three leaders met at Yalta, which, by the way, was a terrible place, which was very difficult to get to for old men as they were. And as you can see, not long afterwards, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died of a massive stroke. Soon afterwards, Hitler committed suicide, and then Germany surrendered. What an event. This is a photograph of the big three at the Yalta Conference. It's interesting to see that Churchill, the oldest, in fact, outlived the other two. Relevant to this picture is also that, this is the pointer, this is Lord Allenbrook here at the back, who I'll come back to in a minute, who was the chief of the Commonwealth Armed Forces, all of them, chief of the Imperial General Staff. Out of interest, by this is Lord Portal, who was chief of fighter command. Let's look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Let's look at him. He's a sick man. Taking all three photographs of him taken at the meeting, look at him. He's a sick man. Compare that with him only 15 months previously at the Tehran conference, which was to plan a bit more of the details of how the war would be fought, where we see a much more vigorous-looking person. And compare him with what he was looking like 1933, 12 years previously, a fit, well-looking man. People were shocked by his appearance. Churchill's personal physician was Lord Moran, Charles Wilson, as he was previously known. He later became president of the Royal College of Physicians. He was much criticised for comments. He published his diaries of his dealing particularly with Churchill's health, and it was felt that he shouldn't have done so when he published the book, on the grounds he was interfering with medical confidentiality, that he was giving away secrets and truths about his patients. And this was thought to be outrageous, and I remember reading this when I was a medical student, and how he was very heavily criticised. But in the diaries, which I have actually read, he makes this point: the president appears a very sick man. I give him only a few months to live. Another grandee of politics in those days in America was Averell Harriman, who would later fail to become president, but he'd been mayor of New York, he was a diplomat, and he said, I was terribly shocked at the change since November when Roosevelt won the fourth term, unprecedented, of course, in world history, fourth term as President of the United States of America. The signs of deterioration seem to be unmistakable. I'll come back to Harriman in a few minutes. Then, on the Thursday, the 12th of April, in Walnut Street, California, this happened. At this stage, a physician called Howard Bruen, cardiologist, was looking after him. His personal physician, Vice Admiral McIntyre, was in fact in Washington. He had a good day. He had a slight headache and was given slight relief from massage. In the morning, however, he was being sketched. What is sketch? He was having a portrait painted by a woman called Elizabeth Shumatoff. He suddenly complained of a terrific headache and lost consciousness. Bruen arrived within 15 minutes. The patient was deeply unconscious. He had severe hyperreflexia of the right side. He had no leg reflexes for another reason. He had had a polio-like illness about 10 or 15 years earlier, and so had no reflexes in his legs at all. He was diagnosed as having a massive cerebral hemorrhage, and his blood pressure was this. Now, Philip Barton in the audience, of course, the blood pressure after stroke may not be indicative of blood pressure in the pre-stroke condition. But anyway, it's a very, very high blood pressure. I have only once seen a blood pressure this high, and that was in a 15-year-old girl 30 years ago, and she's still alive and well. Bruen telephoned Vice Admiral McIntyre and told him the diagnosis. He pronounced dead during the mid-afternoon of Thursday. The newspapers, of course, all mentioned that he died of a massive stroke, and his personal physician, Vice Admiral McIntyre, said it was totally unexpected. It came out of the clear blue sky. No one could understand why. My sister-in-law, who was 12 at the time, said that there were speculations that he might have been murdered. Why did he die so suddenly? Because he had obviously so unexpected. We'll come back to Admiral Ross T. McIntyre in a minute. There was no post-mortem examination performed. But apparently, according to Franz Mazzerli, his arteries were so severely clogged with plaques that they couldn't actually get the formaldehyde into his arterial system. In America, they have a system whereby they embalm the body and then bury it deep in the ground, which seems to be a very strange thing to do. But anyway, they had to open up several arteries to get the formaldehyde into him to embalm his body. He's buried on Sunday morning in a place called Hyde Park in New York State, 70 hours after death. Curious and interesting, his old friend Churchill did not attend the funeral for reasons I'll come back to, or for reasons I won't come back to, I will explain. Soon afterwards, something very strange happened. His medical records went missing. Some people have suggested that Admiral McIntyre had destroyed them. Can you see this whiff of conspiracy theory already? And no further information available until 1970, when Howard Browen, who was a cardiologist, fellow of the American College of Cardiology, published a paper in An Intern Med. Why the delay? Again, he may have been influenced by the idea that you were breaking medical confidentiality by revealing details of your patients. Moran had been criticized only 6 years earlier for the same problem. Maybe he waited until Ross T. McIntyre had died. That doesn't hold water. I looked at that. Ross McIntyre died in 1959, so it was a big gap. But certainly Ross McIntyre must be questioned. So we now have some more details. Howard Browen first saw Roosevelt when he became ill 1 year before Yalta, where he found he had high blood pressure, left ventricular hypertrophy, heart failure, and a chest infection. He was treated with digitalis leaf, a good Birmingham drug, I should point out, aminophylline, phenobarbital, salt restriction, Graham will be pleased to see, and weight reduction. And he did lose weight, and maybe part of his rather haggard appearance at Yalta may have been due to excessive weight loss. I don't know, he did look very well. He was not given, this is very strange, this word, in view of the complexity of the situation, he was not given a mercurial diuretic, which would have been a good treatment, I think, in those days. The president did, however, recover, and in November 1944, of course, he, rather hale and hearty, won the fourth term as President of the United States of America. He remained on digitalis leaf and phenobarbital on a long-term basis up until the Yalta Conference. As I say, he was elected in November 1944. This is his ECG. Now, one might expect, if his notes have gone missing, why do we still have his ECGs? There's two ECGs in the records. I think the reason is that in those days, of course, ECG was a rather exotic investigation, and it would be kept in the Central Records Department of a hospital. It would not necessarily be included in his notes. So I think if you believe in conspiracy theory, why do we still have an ECG? I think it probably would have been, as in fact was in my hospital when I first qualified, the ECGs were not in the patient's notes. They were in the cardiology department, because they were rather exotic and prone to deterioration. As you can see, he's got what I used to call left axis deviation, a tall R wave in V1 and a deep S wave in V3. It doesn't show too well on the screen, but I've done it very carefully. If you look at his V1 lead, it's deeply negative down to there, and his C6 is up to positive up there. So that makes the sum of the SV1 and RV5 as 46, and the normal range is said to be 35. So he had LVH, and because you can see he's got inverted T waves, what we used to call left ventricular hypertrophy with strain. He's got good going hypertension. This is when Howard Browen saw the patient, and you can see his blood pressure was measured at the time and found to be very high. And this shows the blood pressure throughout the whole of the remaining time when Howard Browen was looking after him. Now, prior to March 1944, of course, all the details are in fact from Admiral Ross T. McIntyre. You can see the blood pressures were really quite good going, indeed rather horrifying, you might argue. Admiral McIntyre commented that the blood pressure was in fact no more than normal for his age, which is the view. It's interesting, he was Vice Admiral Ross T. McIntyre. I wonder how many ENT surgeons are admirals and how many admirals are ENT surgeons. And judging by the number of medals, he must have fought in a great many campaigns, more possibly even than Nelson. This quote from it is quoted in this paper in the Lancet last year, and that's why it was this paper that got me interested in this topic. But we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's look at what was going on at Yalta. Roosevelt, a deeply sick man, was very deeply admiring of the Soviet intense charge across Europe from what was called the Moscow tram stop. Napoleon got into central Moscow, Stalin got as far as the tram stop just outside Moscow, and charged across, driving the Germans with a huge loss of life. The sacrifices made by the Russian people was inestimable. He was keen to persuade Stalin that we should be making a new world order with the United Nations, where, of course, previously the League of Nations had failed, mainly because of the Americans, actually. There was the Russo-Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941, and he wanted Stalin to renege on that and declare war on Japan, which indeed he did. And, of course, he also did agree to the creation of the United Nations. Yes, he wanted democracy of the Eastern European states. I think both of them were deeply fond of Churchill, and very difficult not to be, because he was such a strange man. But he spent Churchill being an old-fashioned imperialist, sort of what Britain and her empire last for 1,000 years. And, of course, he was exactly what he was. What's amazing is that Churchill was horrifyingly opposed to the independence of India. And when Mountbatten came back from India, having independence, he would not speak to Mountbatten because he thought it was our empire, Britain and her empire. Strange and extraordinary throwback. So Roosevelt's agenda was very much not to appease Stalin, but certainly to admire him and persuade him to do things, particularly to the United Nations and to declare war on Japan. Churchill's agenda, well, he was very keen. Remember, we'd gone to war over Poland in the first place. And he wanted Eastern Europe to have democracy and Poland to be mistress of our house and captain of our soul. It was a wonderful turn of phrase from the old man. He was keen that the Polish people who come to fought in the Battle of Britain and the British Army should be represented in the elections, and that never happened. He was prepared to make concessions at the borders of post-war Poland. Remember that Poland had been, for centuries, stuck between Russia and Germany as two powers. The borders between eastern Poland and western part of the Soviet Union were very porous. There was the Russification of Poland. At one stage in eastern Poland, Polish language was banned. They had to speak Russian. So the borders of Poland had been very variable for centuries, and therefore he was prepared to make some sort of agenda on what about the benefit. But he wanted Poland to be independent. We had gone to war over Poland. Now, there are people who said that, in fact, Churchill betrayed the Polish. I read a novel some years ago about a plot by Polish emigres to murder Churchill for his outrageous crime of betraying Poland. That does not hold water if you look at the facts. And Stalin's agenda, well, he wanted already to dominate Eastern Europe, but he already had Poland. He was already there. He'd taken Poland. And the idea that somehow it was all stitched up and that Stalin could or could not concede Poland was nonsense. They'd already there in Poland, charging across to the border into Germany. And he had this weird idea that Churchill and Roosevelt would make a separate peace treaty with Germany and allow the Russians to go on fighting it out in the East. So all three of them were paranoid. But the illness was the problem. Lord Allenbrook, who was intellectual, he's the first person to publish memoirs, by the way, of the war, deeply critical of Churchill, quite unpleasantly so, at a time when Churchill was perceived to be a national hero. But Allenbrook left Yalta early to go on what seemed a gastronomic tour of Eastern Europe, leaving Churchill 2 more days in his losing battle for Europe's future against the cynical chauvinism of Russia and the global credulity and growing weariness of the American. Later, Allen wrote in his diary, the president, now failing fast, was far too ill to respond to his old friend's repeated admonitions on the line of folly of the Russians overrun more of Europe than necessary. Roosevelt, I think, realized that he'd been had, and the word "we have been had," in fact, was said at the time. And you can see about a month later, not long before he died, Averell Harriman, was right. We can't do business with Stalin. He's broken every one of the promises he made at Yalta. So he was a deeply saddened man. Just going back about Roosevelt's medical condition, he did have a paralytic illness in 1931. which he caught whilst in Canada, which was thought also to be a source of conspiracy. It was diagnosed at the time of poliomyelitis, but more recently there's been papers suggesting it may in fact have been acute ascending polyneuritis, or Guillain-Barré syndrome, a condition which was in those days not recognized in the United States of America as being a medical condition. It was a French disease. There's another hypothesis which is interesting, more serious. I haven't actually read this book, but I came across the details of it. There's this lesion above his eye. It suggests this might have been a melanoma, which was later removed, and therefore the catastrophic illness just after Yalta could have been due to melanoma of the brain, metastasis, with what we now call a tumor bleed. I think we can apply Occam's razor to that one. We have a perfectly good reason why the man should have a stroke. He had hypertension and LVH, for goodness sake. So why hypothesize this extremely rare condition? I've been involved in many stroke projects, and I've never seen such a thing. There is, of course, another hypothesis, which is very interesting. This is Elizabeth Shumatoff. This is a thing I came off by chance, just wandering around the internet. This is an organization called Reformation.org, which is a strange sect, have all sorts of interesting ideas. And they say that, in fact, FDR was poisoned by his cardiologist, Howard Bruin. Elizabeth Shumatoff, artist was in inverted commas here, was in fact an MI6 agent. And she was painting Roosevelt. That's true, she was painting. Here's the unfinished portrait, perhaps looking a little bit better than he did at Yalta, because that may have been an artistic license to make him look less unwell. Also present was one of Roosevelt's many mistresses, and I believe that actually does hold together. He had we might have said, a rather open-ended relationship with several women. And she also worked for MI6. And they disappeared immediately from the scene and were never questioned about the timely death. In fact, I think they mean untimely. And this is about some of the things from the religious right, often some grammatically and so on. They're quite hilarious to read. It's funny. So I think they meant untimely death. So all these little oddities like this are not mine. Who organized this? Who organized this terrible murder, historically? I can reveal that Reformation.org tells us who it was. Roald Dahl. He was indeed in Washington at the time. I'll come back to that in a minute or two. He didn't write books. They were written by MI6 agents in London. In fact, he did write only one children's book during the war. It's called The Gremlins. It was about those little devils that make aeroplane engines go wrong. It's called The Gremlins. Eleanor Roosevelt had a copy. I don't know if she bought it or Dahl regularly had lunch with the Roosevelts and a lot of other people. And she read a copy as a bedtime story to her grandchildren, The Gremlins. That's the only children's book he published during the war. The Reformation.org picture of Dahl does not include Hemingway. The picture shows both of them. But the one in Reformation shows Roald Dahl. Glamorous man, fighter pilot's wings, off flying because of a minor head injury. Also, I think he found flying quite difficult because Spitfire cockpits were rather small for people who were 6'6". His own literary talents were so bad that he had to write sentence stuff to Playboy magazine, apparently. So that's interesting conspiracy theory. Now, we do have to ask some questions. Why did FDR's notes go missing? That's a great question. And of course, that's good for you. Why didn't Churchill attend the funeral? He wrote to the king, saying, I can't go, I've got to stay at home and mind the shop, was basically his message. Eden was at the funeral, but no, that's the foreign secretary, but not Churchill. Whereas Churchill was deeply fond of Roosevelt. So it's very strange that he should have done this. Why was he buried so hastily? He's buried on a Sunday morning, having died on a Thursday afternoon. There was no post-mortem, of course. What was Roald Dahl doing in Washington? Well, he was, in fact, assistant air attaché at the British Embassy. His fighting time was over because of this minor head injury, which means he couldn't fly airplanes particularly safely anymore, although he wasn't valid. He was a fit man, basically. He was a glamorous man. He was a literary figure. When he got to Washington, of course, he bumped into C.S. Forester, who was told, stay in America and write Hornblower stories because they're good for propaganda. And he met C.S. Forester, who encouraged him to write his books and write his memoirs and so on, and then get on with the children's books. Roald Dahl's role in Washington was interesting, very much not so much as a spy, although he was said to be a spy, but he was more reporting back on what people were saying, Most of this, as far as I can see, having read his memoir, not his memoir, the biography of Roosevelt, much of his activity in Washington seemed to involve adopting the horizontal position. But he wasn't really spying on anyone. He was just reporting that Mrs. So-and-so said that her husband was going to do this and that sort of thing, and reporting back. Why the delay in publishing Hard Facts? Howard Brewer in 1970, again, one must speculate, why was this? And of course, this is a wonderful area for conspiracy theories. Howard Brewer, when he published the paper, the last paragraph, the last sentence of his paper here, I've often wondered what course of events might have been had modern methods of control of blood pressure been available. 1970, of course, blood pressure treatments wasn't particularly successful. Methyl dopa, besanidine, the diuretics, of course, were there. That's rehabilitated today. One can only speculate on that one. Harriman, in this particular, I mentioned this bit here, at Yalta, I believe he didn't have the strength to be quite as stubborn as he liked to be. I suppose if FDR had been in better health, he might have held out longer. But I don't believe it would have made any difference. It would not have made any difference. Stalin had already taken Poland, and he wasn't going to give it back. So Harriman, I think, was right. The second consequence of this cataclysmic stroke was only come to the fore last year when basically a paper on the history of the Framingham Project. And this is a direct quote from that. His sudden death while still in office shows a poor state of understanding of cardiovascular disease in the mid-20th century. There was no epidemiology. The data we had, which Pickering, of course, used, was mainly insurance company data from the Society of Actuaries and the insurance companies of North America, which, of course, were confined to people who had the good fortune to be insured. They were good data, and there were plenty of it, but we needed a proper study, and there was no such study. So, in fact, soon after this, in 1947, the National Health Act was passed, which to establish an epidemiological study on heart disease, which was supported by Paul Dudley White, who was a great cardiologist in America. And then in 1948, Harry Truman, the Congress declares that the nation's health is severely threatened by diseases of the heart circulation, including high blood pressure. He must have been aware very much of his predecessor's horrifying death. Why Framingham? Well, it was close to Harvard. Paul Dudley White was at Harvard, of course, and other cardiologists at the Massachusetts General. FDR was a Harvard graduate. But also Framingham had already taken part in a population study, a tuberculosis study, so there was form. They knew what to do, how to do it, and they were enthusiastic. It was said of Framingham, stable middle-class European origin population, thought to be representative of the USA in the 1940s. It's an interesting thing to say in this day and age. We wouldn't quite say that now, would we? This is just a picture of the church in Framingham, postcard. Why else? Well, Roosevelt's son lived in Framingham. Eleanor Roosevelt visited James and his wife, and they had a spaghetti supper. That proves it, doesn't it? Out of interest, by the way, James's wife, Betsy, was the daughter of Harvey Cushing, the great neurosurgeon and hypertensionologist. FDR actually never went to Framingham, but he passed through it on a campaign at 3 miles an hour on a train. In autumn 1944, during the election campaign, he's said to have waved to 10,000 people. Well, obviously, we must do the whole thing in Framingham. And in 1948, the first volunteer was examined, and the rest is history. It is the greatest epidemiological project ever undertaken. Not the biggest, not necessarily the best, but the greatest in the sense it was pioneering. So, in summary, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, if Roosevelt had not been so ill, might the domination of Eastern Europe by Russia have been avoided? I think the answer is probably not. I agree with Admiral Harriman on that one. The disposition of the troops at that time meant we were a long way from Berlin, but Stalin was very near to Berlin, and the race to get to Berlin was won by Stalin. Did Roosevelt's stroke contribute to the creation of the Framingham Heart Study? Well, it probably did, yes. I think now the paper published last year, I think is correct in saying that this drew attention to our appalling lack of knowledge on hypertension. Can I thank you for your attention to this interesting side of history, perhaps overstated, but full of conspiracy theories, and that's what I like about it. Thank you.
Garrett, that was wonderful. I see everybody taking notes. I suspect everybody in this room would like a copy of your slides. Would you be prepared to put them on our
Yes,
website?
no problem at all.
We'll do that. We'll arrange for that to happen. I just have one observation, and that is that Eisenhower had an undiagnosed pheochromocytoma. Roosevelt died of malignant hypertension.
Well, it probably did, yes, sure.
And what was his name? Fell off his horse. The president's brain is missing. Who was that?
Reagan.
Reagan fell off his horse, and it took 3 months to diagnose the subdural hematoma. It just seems to me that being president of the United States is a pathway to very poor health care.
apart from assassination, of course, several of them have been assassinated.
Can I thank you for this wonderful exposition? And ladies and gentlemen, Gareth Beevers, our ex-president.